Across pre-colonial Africa, spirituality shaped identity at every level of society. The boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual realm were fluid, and the presence of ancestors, deities, and unseen forces influenced daily life, community roles, and social expectations. Within this expansive spiritual landscape existed a rich spectrum of gender expressions and identities. Many African societies recognized that certain spiritual callings or ancestral occupations required individuals to adopt roles, attire, or behaviors that differed from those assigned at birth. This episode explores the interplay between spirituality and gender diversity in pre-colonial Africa. Drawing from ethnographic studies, oral traditions, linguistic evidence, and early European accounts, it highlights how gender-fluid and gender-diverse individuals held respected positions in many African spiritual systems. We also examine how colonial disruption reshaped these traditions and introduced new forms of stigma that persist today. Understanding the role of spirituality in African gender systems requires an appreciation of how African cosmologies traditionally viewed the relationship between the body, the spirit, and community roles. In many African societies, gender was not understood as a strictly biological designation, but as a combination of social function, spiritual calling, and ancestral influence. In several cultures, the identity of a person was believed to be shaped by the ancestors who guided them. It was widely accepted that an ancestor could embody a gender different from that of the person they called. As a result, individuals serving as mediums or ritual specialists often adopted roles, attire, and behaviors associated with the ancestor's gender rather than their own. The concept that gender expression could be shaped by spiritual influence was not unusual. It was a culturally coherent system in which a male-born individual might align socially with feminine roles due to ancestral calling. A female-born individual might adopt masculine roles as part of their spiritual responsibility. And some individuals expressed multiple gender traits because they were believed to embody more than one spiritual force. These identities were not usually marginalized. Instead, they were understood as fulfilling necessary religious and communal functions. Southern Africa provides numerous examples of fluid gender expression rooted in spiritual responsibilities. Among Nguni-speaking peoples, including the Zulu, Xhosa, Ndebele, and Swazi, ancestral callings played a central role in determining social and spiritual identity. Individuals chosen to become sangomas, or spiritual healers, often underwent transformations that were linked to the identity of the calling ancestor. During initiation, a trainee medium might display behaviors or adopt expressions that reflected the gender of the ancestral spirit guiding them. In many cases, these expressions persisted throughout their lives as part of their spiritual identity. Ethnographic accounts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe male-born individuals who adopted feminine attire or mannerisms after being called by female ancestors. Their gender expression was not seen as impersonation, but as a sign of authenticity, indicating alignment with the ancestral realm. Female-born individuals called by male ancestors experienced similar transformations. These expressions were widely accepted within their communities because the authority of the ancestor superseded expectations based on anatomy or social convention. Spiritual legitimacy provided protection and respect, even when gender presentation differed from local norms. In some communities, individuals who embodied both masculine and feminine traits were believed to possess heightened spiritual sensitivity. Their duality was considered evidence of a complex ancestral lineage. Far from being stigmatized, such individuals were often entrusted with mediation, healing, or conflict resolution. Moving eastward, similar patterns emerge among groups such as the Acholi, Langi, and other Nilotic-speaking communities of Uganda, Kenya, and South Sudan. These societies maintain distinct frameworks through which spirit possession and ancestral communication shape gender expression. Among the Acholi, spirit mediums known as Awaka often underwent gendered transformations during possession rituals. A medium channeling a female ancestor adopted feminine speech patterns, movements, and attire. When channeling a male ancestor, the same medium adopted masculine behaviors. These shifts were not viewed as unusual, but as manifestations of the ancestor's identity. Possession ceremonies were central to Acholi spiritual life. and the gendered transformation of mediums provided evidence of the ancestors' active presence. The community evaluated the authenticity of these transformations not by conformity to biological sex, but by the consistency and clarity of the ancestors' expression. The Langi, whom we discussed in earlier episodes, recognized the Mudoko Dako, feminine male individuals who were socially categorized alongside women. While some Mudoko Dako identities related to everyday gender roles, others were rooted in spiritual functions. Their gender expression reflected both social integration and ancestral significance. The Langi also had spirit mediums whose gender identity shifted depending on the spirit inhabiting them. This shifting identity was considered part of a legitimate spiritual performance. On the Swahili coast, spirit possession traditions such as Unyago, Pepita, and Ngoma included ritual dance and trance states in which participants temporarily adopted gendered behaviors reflective of the spirit's identity. These events, often led by gender non-conforming individuals, reinforced the idea that the spiritual world could influence or override social expectations surrounding gender. West Africa contains some of the richest evidence of gender fluidity rooted in spiritual cosmology. Among the Yoruba, Igbo, Fon, and other communities of the region, deities themselves often embodied complex or shifting gender attributes. Human gender expression reflected these cosmological truths. In Yoruba cosmology, divine figures known as orishas exhibit a wide range of gender expressions. Deities such as Oshun, Oya, and Shango hold traits associated with both masculinity and femininity. Obatala, responsible for shaping human bodies, is widely interpreted as androgynous. Olodumare, the supreme source of creation, is beyond gender entirely. These models shaped how Yoruba people understood gender. Individuals were believed to carry specific destinies tied to the deities overseeing them. As a result, gender expression could vary according to spiritual alignment. Yoruba spiritual practitioners, including priests and priestesses of the orishas, often adopted dress or mannerisms reflecting the gender of the orisha they served. Some engaged in spirit marriages in which they became the symbolic spouse of a deity. Such marriages sometimes involved adopting gendered qualities associated with the deity, regardless of the practitioner's birth anatomy. Among the Igbo, spiritual individuals associated with Agwu, a force representing insight, unpredictability, and creative energy, frequently displayed behaviors considered atypical within gendered norms. Their identity was shaped not by their body but by the nature of the spirit inhabiting them. Igbo societies also recognized gender categories that shifted according to life stage or lineage responsibilities, demonstrating flexibility within gender roles. The Fon of Dahomey, present-day Benin, maintained ceremonial roles in which individuals adopted gender-diverse expressions as part of their service to royal ancestors or deities. Some priesthoods required mixed gender attire or androgyny as part of ritual practice. In these traditions, gender diversity was considered essential to spiritual authenticity. Central Africa features numerous traditions in which spiritual roles involve gender flexibility. The Congo Basin, for example, is home to communities with long-established systems of mediumship, divination, and ritual performance. Among these groups, gender diversity appears frequently in the context of spirit possession. Mediums might adopt attire or behavior that reflected the gender of the spirit communicating through them. Some mediums adopted these expressions permanently, maintaining a gender identity that differed from their birth assignment. In many cases, these individuals were believed to possess special insight or access to ancestral wisdom. Their gender diversity was not interpreted as individual eccentricity, but as part of a broader spiritual framework. The Azande provide additional examples of gender diversity intertwined with spiritual and social roles. While best known for male-male partnerships, as discussed in earlier episodes, the Azande also recognize gender non-conforming individuals who perform specific spiritual or domestic responsibilities. Gender in Azande society existed within a continuum shaped partly by social expectations and partly by spiritual dynamics. Northern Africa contains some of the most ancient evidence of gender diversity in spiritual contexts. Ancient Egyptian mythology, for instance, includes numerous deities with fluid or composite gender identities. Atum, the primordial creator, was believed to embody both masculine and feminine principles, having generated the first divine beings alone. Hapi, the god of the Nile, is depicted with both male and female physical characteristics, symbolizing fertility and life. Other deities, such as Sekhmet and Ptah, intertwine masculine and feminine energies in ways that challenge binary classifications. These representations indicate that non-binary gender identities were integral to ancient Egyptian understandings of the divine. Archaeological evidence shows that priests serving certain deities adopted attire or ritual roles that blended gender expressions, reflecting the gender attributes of the gods they served. In Amazigh, Berber communities across the Maghreb, certain spiritual ceremonies involve mixed-gender costuming or cross-gender performance. These roles were tied to ancestral veneration and community ritual rather than expressions of personal identity, but they demonstrate the presence of gender diversity within spiritual practice long before colonial influence. European colonial administrators encountered these gender-diverse spiritual systems with skepticism and, in many cases, hostility. Victorian-era norms framed gender strictly in terms of binary categories aligned with Christian theology. As a result, colonial observers misunderstood or dismissed the spiritual significance of gender diversity in African societies. Colonizers frequently described gender non-conforming spiritual practitioners as possessed, perverse, or degenerate. These judgments were grounded not in anthropological insight, but in moral frameworks imported from Europe. Missionaries condemned spiritual practices involving gender diversity as incompatible with Christianity. They targeted spirit mediums, sangomas, diviners, and ritual specialists for conversion or punishment, often suppressing the traditions that granted legitimacy to gender-diverse roles. Colonial governments enacted laws and policies that restricted or banned certain spiritual ceremonies. These actions disrupted the cultural systems that had previously supported gender-diverse individuals. The suppression of indigenous spirituality played a large role in the erasure of pre-colonial gender diversity. One of the long-term consequences of colonial misinterpretation was the erasure of gender-diverse histories. Colonial administrators, missionaries, and early ethnographers rarely documented gender diversity accurately. Instead, they imposed European categories on African societies, misrepresenting or omitting practices that contradicted their own moral expectations. This erasure occurred through several mechanisms. Censorship. Colonial writers ignored or minimized practices they viewed as improper. Moral framing. Indigenous gender diversity was described through derogatory language. Selective documentation. Practices aligned with European norms were recorded. Others were omitted. Educational influence. Missionary schools taught rigid gender norms incompatible with African traditions. Administrative restructuring. Colonial governance removed or replaced indigenous roles tied to spiritual identity. The cumulative effect was the gradual disappearance of gender-diverse spiritual roles from public knowledge. The next generations grew up unaware of traditions that their ancestors had once accepted as natural. After African nations gained independence in the mid to late 20th century, many retained legal, educational, and religious systems introduced during the colonial era. As a result, colonial gender norms continued to shape social perceptions long after colonization formally ended. Even in regions where indigenous spiritual practices persisted, colonial attitudes influenced how gender diversity was interpreted. What was once understood as a sacred role could be reclassified as deviant or immoral under the combined pressure of Christian doctrine, state law, and post-colonial identity politics. This continuity explains why many African societies today believe gender diversity and queer identity to be foreign influences, despite extensive evidence of their pre-colonial existence. Colonial frameworks became so deeply embedded that they replaced indigenous understandings in collective memory. Re-examining these histories serves several important purposes. First, it restores accuracy. African gender-diverse spiritual roles existed long before European colonization. Recognizing them corrects misconceptions about African history. Second, it promotes cultural continuity. For individuals seeking to reconnect with ancestral traditions, understanding gender diversity within African spiritual systems provides insight into long-standing cultural patterns. Third, it challenges modern narratives that rely on colonial frameworks. Many contemporary arguments against gender diversity in Africa are based on colonial laws, religious doctrines, and misinterpretations of history. Fourth, it fosters inclusivity and safety. The recovery of Africa's gender-diverse past can help protect individuals targeted for their gender identity by demonstrating that such identities have indigenous precedents. Finally, it contributes to the global understanding of how gender diversity has shaped human societies across time and geography. Throughout pre-colonial Africa, gender diversity was woven into the spiritual, social, and cultural life of many societies. Individuals who adopted roles outside binary gender categories did so, not in defiance of local norms, but in alignment with them, often fulfilling essential responsibilities within their communities. These identities were shaped by spiritual callings, ancestral obligations, ritual duties, and local cosmologies that recognize gender as a fluid and multifaceted aspect of human experience. Colonial authorities misunderstood or rejected these systems, imposing rigid binaries that reshaped African social structures and obscured their historical complexity. By revisiting the evidence, we restore a more accurate understanding of Africa's past, one in which gender diversity played a meaningful and respected role. This knowledge helps reframe modern discussions and create space for greater acceptance and understanding.